Good afternoon, everybody, in hdfs 317. Today I want to continue the work we did earlier this week by delivering the second part of a lecture based on Chapter 5 from Cook, Klein, and Chen, Teaching Children with Specific Disabilities. So you'll find these materials in Module 5. So we've already talked about the basic process for individualizing interventions, and we went into detail on a couple of conditions with regard to overall considerations and then specific suggestions about how you might support students. And today what I'd like to do is I'd like to present some of the highlights around two other conditions, and then we're going to work toward some more universal strategies that you can use as you are getting to know your students. So today we're going to talk about difficulties in learning, some things to consider when you're working with students with that profile, as well as physical disabilities. We definitely encourage you to read all of the sections of Chapter 5 that cover other conditions. And I think that you'll find that some of their appendices, lists of modifications per setting, are really worth the time in looking through and keeping in mind should you find yourself working in these child-related fields. Then we will talk about these general strategies, but please keep in mind you're always going to want to modify any strategy you deliver to a student, but particularly one that is useful across the board in a general kind of way. Those are the strategies that often require the most modification. So as we consider how to support students with difficulties in learning, we're talking about children who may be presenting with a global developmental delay, meaning that several aspects of thinking and solving problems are currently impacted, would also involve some motor and speech delays. Or we could be discussing a child with something described as a specific learning disability, where one set of skills, say reading and literacy, is impaired, demonstrably impaired, more impaired than would be expected given their skills in other areas. So that's when you have a relative weakness in somebody's profile and you're just going to modify for one specific aspect of learning. And then as students age, we move from describing them as having a developmental delay to then determining around the age of 8 in most cases, although you can do this at the age of 5 for individuals with specific known etiologies or causes for their developmental delays. We use the term intellectual disability after the age of 8, and this is usually defined by looking at overall intellectual functioning in both verbal and nonverbal ways of processing information. And the person who has an intellectual disability is going to be able to learn and grow all the time, but is going to do so at a overall slower pace across the lifespan. So when working with individuals with learning difficulties, you're definitely going to want to collaborate with learning specialists. They may be called educational specialists or instructional coaches. You'll also work with colleagues who are behavioral specialists and allied health therapists, such as speech, OT, and psychology. And as with all the other conditions we've discussed, it'll be critically important to maintain your collaboration and rapport with the child's parents and family. So in general, you want to be on the lookout for what you might think of as invisible processing problems. These are areas of processing information, manipulating information, and then formulating and giving information back that can definitely get in the way for some learners. Many children with learning difficulties could have a problem processing the information that's coming in, and if you understand the profile of their strengths and weaknesses in the different ways of interacting with information, you can then work with the child's strengths in order to bolster those areas of weakness. The more you know about the specific processing problem, the more you can consider which accommodations and adaptations make the most sense. So if, for example, you're working with a child who has a difficulty in visual and spatial processing, then you are not going to use visual cues as often to support new learning. You're going to have to, in fact, teach that child how to use visual information to make sense of their environment. If you know that a child has significant difficulties in auditory processing, which basically means they can hear, sounds are coming in, but in the decoding of those sounds, something is going awry, making it difficult to understand spoken language, particularly in the absence of visual cues. So, for example, a person with an auditory processing problem often finds it difficult to talk on the telephone because they lack the information they need visually from that social interaction. So these sorts of processing problems can be evident in a person with any kind of learning difficulty. They can also help us understand sort of the foundational aspect of the learning difficulty and really guide our interventions. It's also important to remember that many students who have any kind of processing or learning problem often have difficulty maintaining the appropriate levels of arousal, attention, and alertness during all of their learning activities. And we would refer to this cluster of behaviors as self-regulation, really the ability to regulate your own attention, behavior, and emotions as you are engaged in different contexts. So many children with difficulties in learning are going to be delayed or at least be challenged by processing a lot of information that's coming in at once, and then being able to make sense of that information, interpret it in a way that kind of reflects what's going on to other people, communicate what that experience is like for them. So with all of the processing challenges, there's an additional amount of energy a child has to put into maintaining appropriate self-regulation. And you can almost think of it as, those seesaws, that the more stresses you put on one end of the teeter-totter or the seesaw, the harder it gets to cope with things. So it's important to just know that having a learning difficulty puts a person at risk for struggling sometimes with self-regulation. And the form of those self-regulation difficulties is going to change from child to child. Some may become very upset quickly or be difficult to console. Others may have a hard time holding themselves back when they want to move towards something that they're really interested in. Just be on the lookout that it's a possibility. It's also important to keep in mind that many children, particularly those with mild issues in one or more of these processing areas, will work really hard to use their strengths to compensate and even cover up or sort of camouflage their difficulties. So some students will put a lot of pressure on themselves and could be vulnerable to becoming more anxious as they try to self-monitor their own ability to do what they need to do in a situation. So in the areas of difficulties in learning, sometimes it can be more difficult to cope with a mild difference than with a significant difference in learning. So you want to keep that in mind. Now, there are many specific strategies for teaching children with different kinds of learning difficulties. And if you find this topic interesting, the field of educational psychology or becoming an instructor support person, kind of a specialist in curriculum or instruction, could be a really interesting career. So specific strategies for kids with learning difficulties, we're going to be very brief here, just cover the highlights, but please know there's a very deep technology here that is definitely worth pursuing if you find this interesting. First thing we do when we know a student is struggling to learn is look around the environment and try to find ways to have physical structures and visual supports that are natural to the environment, like signs, for example, an exit sign by a door. Make sure we have the physical and visual structure to encourage as much independence in classroom routines as possible. So, for example, some children with a nonverbal learning disability have problems remembering how to get from point A to point B. It can help them if there is a path of carpet that goes from the children's desks right to where the finished box is for where you'll deposit your assignments. So having visual cues that provide a little additional navigation information can support independence in classroom routines. You really don't want students having to ask for help or not acting on something like handing in their work because no one reminded them and they didn't ask for help. Instead, you want to build in as many supports as you can to encourage independence in those routines. Whenever there is a challenge that any learner needs to face, we really have to look at motivation. Some learners, especially as they get older, will be motivated internally because they want to master the material. Many individuals at young ages who have a learning challenge can be very motivated to learn, but then get frustrated because they often require increased practice and repetition at a new skill in order to master it. So they have to manage motivation over a longer time than individuals who might learn skills more quickly. So we have to think about changing up the motivations, keeping it fun, adding novel motivators, keeping the ones they love the most, but basically also adding some change and recycling. And usually in my experience, motivating effort, motivating getting started, building behavioral momentum more than motivating accomplishments. It's really necessary to just get the ball rolling. You also usually want to teach in short, focused bursts. We often refer to them as work periods, followed by a break. And during that break, it's best if they're doing something they prefer. If the child needs to be at a desk, those break items could be things like a word search that fits the environment, goes right on the desk. If the child is actually doing the work of a young child and is on the floor doing free play and every so often doing communication items, you would just present a novel toy right there in that area. So you want to make your work and your break activities occurring in short, focused bursts in regular routines, and often with a visual or a verbal or perhaps a little song that signals that you're moving from work to break. The other thing that you want is flexibility, that when a student is able to regulate pretty well and open to learning, you can increase your expectations, work for longer, and then be sure to follow up with a really good break because they've earned it. Also be careful not to make breaks too short, because that can just frustrate a child. And so you want to make sure that you're not just giving them 10 seconds and they're basically practicing receiving a toy they love and then losing it right away. That's not a break. That's sort of punishing. We are always thinking about visual cues and prompts to support our oral language. This is good for the students who do learn visually. It's also helpful to the students who need to learn how to make use of visual cues, because eventually in the adult world they'll need to look at their phone to get information. They'll need to seek out visual cues, and that can start early. In general, try to talk less and replace verbal prompts, Marshall, please do this, with something that is like a gentle physical touch to move their hands in, sort of a general direction of the task, or ideally a gestural cue, or like a point to something they need to do. Those, as you'll see in the text, are easier to fade, and you can promote generalization across environments better, and they kind of fit in and help with inclusion. The child is not constantly being spoken to by an adult more than other children, but they are getting some cues. It's also a good idea to demonstrate how to do something, even if it seems simple to you. Some children may have a hard time using two hands together, for example, and it's surprising how difficult that can make all kinds of tasks, everything from picking up a pencil and knowing how to put your hand on your paper in order to mark it. So think really carefully about how you can show a child a task before asking them to do it. Now, granted, you can model it live yourself. There's some research that suggests that children learn more from watching a same-age child do an activity, so you could try that. You can also do like a little visual to-do list where it breaks down the steps either in words or with pictures. Or there are times when I will go online. There are a couple of different internet services. One is called modelme.com. modelme.com, me.com, which are basically a library of video models of tasks that parents can use when they subscribe to this service to show their kids different ways that things can be done. I have also often made a lot of my own films just using an iPhone of either myself doing a task or another child. Ideally, if you can catch the child you're working with on film doing something well, that's phenomenal. Those make for fantastic models. Kids love to see themselves doing things well, and often they just love to see themselves on film. If I'm working with a student who's still learning a task and doesn't yet have all of the steps down, I will often film him in the situation and then provide as many prompts and supports as I need to get him through those other steps moving on, so that what he sees is himself doing it correctly, trying to make my help invisible, but he's not just out there on his own. So watching others model it, as well as giving the child an opportunity to watch himself do a skill, can be a really powerful learning opportunity. And I find that it's often the best reward for trying a different task is when we look at that film together. Now, on the other hand, I would just want to say it's not a good idea to film a child not succeeding, having a tantrum, a meltdown, self-regulation problems, and then trying to show it to them to teach them through it. That's not a good idea. I use video purely for positive modeling and reinforcement and practice. It's great for visual learners. And then lastly, an important strategy is to provide frequent practice and repetition of a skill, and to really try to do it from the beginning in multiple places and with lots of different people. So think, for example, of a child who has a specific learning disability in math, and you really want to work on number sense, that understanding that 1, 2, 3 is actually a set of symbols that refers to this item and this item and this item. So you've got that concept of one-on-one correspondence, but then you also have to teach the concept of what we call seriation, that 1 comes first, followed by 2, followed by 3. For some children, being able to bring those two things together, the symbol system and the seriation, is what makes number sense a hard thing to acquire. And so if you keep that in mind, the best way to try to strengthen that, the research suggests, is to build numbers in to the child's daily routine in as many ways as possible, so that when they are eating snack, you ask them how many crackers do they want, and you might, depending on their level, show them 2 and say 2 crackers, and show them a little pile of 3 and say, or 3 crackers. You are building in numerical concepts in lots of different ways throughout the child's regular day. That's the best way to promote generalization and learning of new concepts, but you have to be really thoughtful about what kinds of learning you're going to want to stimulate. All right, let's go ahead now then and talk about physical disabilities. And here, you definitely are going to collaborate with many different individuals who interact with the student: healthcare providers, physical and occupational therapists, feeding specialists, AAC, speech, all of that. In addition, you're going to want to collaborate with the child's parents. So there are several considerations to keep in mind when you're teaching a child with a physical disability. And first and foremost, it gets back to our important theme that hopefully you're seeing resonate throughout the class, which is how critical it is to do an ongoing assessment of the child's functioning and to really understand as much as you can about how this individual student is presenting. So just as with learning difficulties, there's a pretty large variety of levels of severity, levels of impairment, levels of involvement in physical disabilities, and knowing what you can about the child's condition and baseline level of functioning will be very, very helpful throughout your work with that child. So there are many different conditions that physical disabilities could include, such as cerebral palsy, spina bifida, muscular dystrophy, spinal cord damage. So you can see there's a combination of things a child might be born with, as well as things that the child might acquire. And individual children are going to need different adaptations to the things that I'm about to talk to you about. So for some children, It may be difficult to assess what their preferences are. You might have to work really hard at developing a way to understand the cues they're giving you in order to recognize if they like this way of working with you or if they'd like it to be different. So taking the time to understand, is there a noticeable change in the child's breathing when he's happy or when he's frustrated? Have his parents used eye blinks as a way to indicate a choice? Would you like your chair like this, or would you like it like this? So learn as much as you can about how children can send signals to you that you can read that will help you be responsive to them. It's also important to keep in mind that any kind of motor delay or impairment, even difficulties holding up posture, can adversely impact cognition and language functioning, oftentimes by making your experiential opportunities less common and less complex. So for some children with motor delays, they will need increased practice to be able to overcome some of those impairments and get the learning going across various domains. So when you do see a child with a significant motor condition, you don't assume the lack of an intellectual ability, but you do want to keep in mind that having motor problems can impact a person's interactions and opportunities in the environment. But it can also impact their ability to let you know what they know. And so the better you understand their cues and the more consultation and support that you get in the area of adaptive equipment and technology can be, incredibly helpful for opening up some of those communication channels. So some specific strategies to keep in mind. You definitely want to make sure that you and everybody on the child's team understands the proper handling and positioning of the child, and make sure everyone is trained on these methods. This is critical for keeping a kid safe, healthy, but also comfortable. Definitely need a way to make sure that kids with limited movement are getting appropriate opportunities too for stretching and repositioning. So we want to set up activities too where the child just has a very, very small motor demand, but one within their zone of proximal development so that they can activate a response. That's just a really important strategy and one of the starting points that we use when working in a preschool or elementary school with a student with a physical disability. We are frequently in contact with augmentative and alternative communication specialists, and we often ask for a technology assessment. In some districts and around the state, we talk about the SWAC team, which is a team of technology specialists who can assist teams in problem solving and preparing the educational environment to support students with different abilities and challenges. Whatever technology you choose to use, whether that's a communication board or a wheelchair, you definitely need to have as many backups as you can on hand. Things will go wrong and you're going to need another way to support the skill while the first type of technology is being repaired. Now, some things are too expensive to have a full backup, but you definitely need a functional backup on hand. For example, I worked with a student whose communication book stopped working because he'd thrown it, and the teacher had a very similar program on a classroom iPad, and we were able to transition him to that fairly easily. Really important to think about how if a person's communicating through technology, when they don't have access to that technology, it's like they completely don't have a voice. Imagine what that would be like as you try to navigate your world, but you have no way of letting other people know how you're feeling about things or what you might need. So making sure that we have a low-tech backup for a lot of the adaptive technology we provide is very important. You always want to make sure that you're not rushing a child to respond, particularly if there is an underlying health impairment or physical disability. So you want to be sure that you are delivering your prompts in a clear way, and then there's a long pause so that the child has time to begin to initiate a response. And you'll begin to learn for each child how much time is important to provide, but you want to make sure that there's enough space to respond, to initiate that response, and to complete it. By allowing these opportunities, your role is really to build confidence in the child through these new skills that she's learning. So you're going to want to scaffold and praise for effort and attitude. We're really focused on building up this mindset of the kind of persistence that a person who's dealing with a physical disability often really needs every single day in every single task. So you're going to encourage self-determination and goal setting. We want to make sure that we're involving a child with a physical condition in as many choices as we can so they can have some sense of agency and control over their environment. So having choices of how they'll spend their reward time, who they spend it with, what skill to work on is all really important. Say you're working on using two hands together, for example. You might have a choice of toys that you would offer the child that would involve using two hands. The child then will choose a more highly motivating activity and hopefully stick with the task longer with you. Many times we focus so much on academics in schools that, in my personal opinion, we may put leisure or play skills on kind of a lower priority. And I personally, editorially, professionally, believe that that is a mistake. I think for quality of life, we need to be quite thoughtful and careful about teaching a student with physical or learning difficulties how to self-entertain in a healthy and varied way. We know, for example, that many individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities develop a fixation on one activity and really want to stick with that alone, and sometimes that becomes something sedentary like video games, and it's very difficult to get them to try other things when they're older. When at all possible, at really young ages, I think it's good for any child in a specialized education program, although probably for every child, to spend some time being exposed to different leisure activities, to try and to be actively taught how to play by yourself, doing something you enjoy, how to play with others, how to engage in leisure activities that are sedentary, non-sedentary, inside, outside, with other people, by yourself, etc. We all need something that we enjoy doing and that we could look forward to doing. We need to build this repertoire of leisure and play interests very intentionally. And oftentimes we need to make sure that the activities we're teaching a child to self-entertain with are easily accessible at home. And one of the real services that you can do for a family who's raising a child with a developmental or physical disability is to help that child have ways to have some satisfying self-entertaining time. Not only because you want to see your child happy, but because parents have so many things they have to manage throughout the day. Being able to know their child is safe for 20 minutes because they're engrossed in something is incredibly valuable. So similarly, if you're working with a child with a physical disability, we have to be really thoughtful about finding ways to engage in age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate, high-interest, and enjoyable leisure activities. So we have some research suggesting that being outside more often, for example, is really critical for people with movement difficulties. So finding accessible trails and parks and playgrounds is a really important part of this. And then lastly, do not underestimate the child. Motor skills, sometimes with a lot of practice, can get much stronger. Adaptive equipment can be very helpful, and children with strong motivation, persistence, sense of humor, and strong ability to keep working on hard things can show you absolutely amazing resilience in this area. So don't underestimate any child. I've seen individuals with significant physical disabilities learn to be completely independent in toileting by using an alarm that takes care of the physical cue their body may not necessarily do, and taking themselves through a routine with adaptive equipment that they can do by themselves. So a physical limitation does not mean the skill cannot be learned or adapted in another way. And if you find this area interesting, obviously the area of physical therapy, occupational therapy, but also health and exercise science or recreation therapy could be a really good thing to look into. All right, so we've talked quite a bit about some of these specific things to think about in a cognitive or physical disability situation. Now I want to spend just a few moments on a few general strategies to consider for any learner, and I want to refer you to your text for a deeper dive into all of these. So the first one I wanted to highlight is to definitely make sure that you're providing opportunities to make choices for students across the day and across activities. The more natural these choices are in the environment, the better we can teach children how to advocate for themselves, how to request help. We're also learning more about how to teach them how to request things that they need. And choice making, or that sense of autonomy, helps kids understand their own preferences and needs and kind of learn who they are. So lots of opportunities to make choices. It's also important to keep in mind that a child with a learning difference sometimes feels out of control or like life is happening to them, especially from what we've learned in the research. If the child's learning difficulties are language-based, they can begin to develop a sort of passive narrative because so much doesn't make sense in moment-to-moment interactions right away that they might hang back more. By providing opportunities to make choices, you help kids of all different temperaments to feel more empowered, to feel like they have a sense of autonomy and can develop more confidence to take risks. So can't overemphasize this part enough. And the last thing I'd say there is sometimes we see problem behaviors emerging because a child doesn't have enough opportunities to make choices or assert some control. So I like to give kids choices. Do you want to work on this worksheet for 5 minutes or 10 minutes? At least you get 5 good minutes. That's much better than 10 rambling minutes. Your textbook does a nice job of providing an overview of a technique that we use when we're trying to plan or revise the way that we are supporting a student in a specific task. And this is through a process called an ecological inventory or an ecological assessment. So basically what you do is, let's say for example, you hear from the art teacher in this case that a student is having a difficult time participating and engaging in the tasks in art class, and you need some ideas about what accommodations or adaptations are needed. So somebody would go in and basically observe an art activity and identify or task analyze the steps of the activity, and that's what you see here on identified steps. This is taken from your textbook, figure 5.2. Great photography, huh? Then what you would do is for each one of the steps of your task analysis, you would think through what are the specific skills this student needs to do this step. And with individuals who have motor or physical difficulties, you have to really think hard about, is there a reach involved? Is there a hold? Do you have to sustain the hold? Do you have to coordinate a movement? Is it one hand, two hands? Is it fine motor, gross motor? So you analyzing these things in that level will give you ideas about where you need to prompt or support. Then what you want to think about is watching a student that you're going to be modifying for doing the task as it is naturally done, and see how he does at each of the steps and whether or not there are places or gaps in the chain, they refer to it here as a discrepancy, for where you would need to intervene or support. So you're basically taking a baseline of sorts. You want to just watch how the teacher would do the task in a usual way, analyze for where the problem areas are, and then devise some options for intervening. And then, as we've mentioned before, you usually then try to implement one of these options each time you teach, and you learn from whether or not it works. So your teaching is like a mini experiment. And then there are two two more topics really that I want to address before letting you go for today. And I appreciate your time and attention in watching this videotaped lecture. The next is prompting and fading prompts. We know that how we scaffold or support a student's learning is going to either increase the likelihood that they're going to learn the skill quickly, or it could lend itself to kind of a stalling or an overdependence between the child and the adult. So while we want to provide enough help that the child is successful and takes chances and stretches themselves, we want to also reduce our help the more the child demonstrates learning so that they continue to grow. We want to be very intentional then about the prompting strategies we're going to use, when we use them, and who we use them with. So when you look at the prompting literature, which is often associated with the field of special education, there was a subspecialty referred to as precision teaching, which got really into the specifics of behavioral teaching methods. That then evolved into what we now talk about as applied behavior analysis, which is really kind of making teaching a science project and learning from the data you collect from each teaching interaction on how to try to improve the next one. So you're always taking data on student outcomes, and those are thought to influence teacher behaviors. And if you pay enough attention to the student data, you should be continually changing your approaches so that the child is demonstrating increasing rates of learning. So applied behavior analysis is really about watching and analyzing instruction, changing what you do in an applied way, and letting the child's behavior, their responses, guide what you need to do next. So prompting is an important part of ABA practice. And in fact, I have put in, I believe it's 4 short YouTube videos that I think do a very nice job of illustrating different prompting hierarchies that are useful for teaching different skills. So I'd like you to take a look at those YouTube videos. You will learn about what they call least to most prompting, which is basically the strategy of letting the student do as much independently as possible, and then when you do come in to prompt, you do it in a hierarchy that is least involved to most involved. And then there's also a video clip there on most to least prompting, where you immediately come in and maybe you take your hand on top of the student's hand and you fully prompt them through the task as they're doing it so that they get it right each time. There is some research that suggests that you would choose a different prompting approach based on the characteristics of the learner, and that it sometimes is difficult to predict which learners are going to do best with which strategies. So if you don't have explicit research guidance, which in most cases you won't, you're basically going to do some trial and error on the different strategies and see what the best response is. So in my experience, for example, if I am working with a young child who is not yet able to send functional communication signals. So they might be vocalizing, but they're not using a sign independently to send the equivalent of a single word, or they're not using a single word. They don't maybe have a way of telling you what they want other than taking your hand and putting it on something. For a child who's functioning at that level, we would describe that as minimally verbal. I prefer the most to least prompting strategy, where I would start a new thing like learning how to use a jack-in-the-box by having the child maybe on my lap, I'm from behind and I'm prompting, I've got his hand on the thing to wind up the toy, and we are doing it together. He's practicing the motor movements completely correctly, hopefully, with a little bit of physical support from me. There isn't a delay. I'm not waiting to see if he'll do the next step to see if he'll do it right or not. And my reasoning for that is when children are significantly delayed, they need many opportunities to do it the way a task can be done. Once they've had lots of opportunities with that, and you start to see this when they spontaneously, underneath your hand, are initiating the task, that's when you pull away. So you provide a structured, repeated practice experience. Over time, you might institute a time delay where your hand is still on their hand, you're waiting for something, and then you'll move forward. There are many more sophisticated ways of doing this than I'm describing, but in general, a student with that developmental profile tends to do better with a most to least prompting approach. On the other hand, if I were working with a student who just has a couple of gaps in a skill, is pretty independent, and has a way to communicate with me, I will up the ante a little bit, and I am more likely to choose that least to most approach to prompting, where I'm sitting back and I'm letting the child initiate each step. After a little bit of time, if nothing happens, I might provide a little gestural prompt, or a gentle physical prompt. I try really hard to minimize verbal prompts because those are the ones that children become so dependent on. It is incredibly hard, especially if you're working with more than one child at a time. So you will be verbally prompting, and the world does give us many verbal prompts, but just try to be conscious of using nonverbal prompts because those are easier to fade and easier for kids to become independent with. All right. Errorless learning is a technique that I discussed briefly in class, and I've also posted a video of this on YouTube. I think it's something that it helps to see it to understand. To use errorless learning, you're really planning your instruction ahead of time so that the physical environment is giving easier access to the correct response. In other words, you need something to build behavioral momentum to get a child who maybe is resistant to doing an activity started on the right foot. So you might start out with the correct answer physically right in front of a student, and the incorrect answer is about 12 inches away. As you're working on various trials together, you are pushing the incorrect answer, so to speak, closer to the correct, so that eventually they are having to think more and make a more careful differentiation. But by making these early trials or practices successful, it can really help build up positive affect, keep motivation going, and help a student feel successful. Then the last thing I want to touch on today are different ways to consider communication in any of your instructional or therapeutic activities with children who have special needs. As we all know, appropriate communication is often what a child needs to learn how to do in order to regulate his or her behavior, be able to participate and attend in any kind of group environment. So we always want to think about what an appropriate communication is whenever we see a child acting out in an inappropriate way. So if every time you tell a 3-year-old, come on, it's time for circle, he screams and runs away, that might suggest that he needs an appropriate way to refuse circle. To ask for 1 more minute to play would be one way to do it. Or to be able to be taught to say no circle, in which case we say circle for 1 minute, and we still are going to insist on it, but the child has communicated, so we're going to respond, and we're still going to say, but we're going to try it for a minute. Then when that child is in circle time, we're using some sort of visual way of showing him when his minute is up and he can go and have a break. By teaching a child to appropriately use their words or communicate in a nonverbal way, instead of using an inappropriate or reactive behavior, you are actually laying the foundation for a whole lot of important self-regulation later on in that student's career. So while a student who's taught to sit in circle time at first just for a minute is going to miss out on some initial learning opportunities in a circle. You're going to have to try to find ways to provide that instruction individually. But to me, for a student who can't behave well in circle yet, they need to learn the communication and behavioral control to be in a group environment. And then as soon as we've got that, we're increasing it from 1 minute to 2 minutes to 3 minutes to 4 to 5 to 6. Now he's in circle all the time. But sometimes self-management is a priority for a child's learning. And that would be in the case when acting out behaviors or a lack of good communication to get what they need are really taking over the student's experience. If it is not affecting Circle as often as I'm describing, if it's just a minor issue, then you would make an instructional decision, do what you can to modify to try to maintain the child in Circle for as long as possible. But you just want to think about what I'm trying to say here is just how fundamental having good requesting and functional communication skills are, verbal or nonverbal, for any learner. So we do want to figure out what their signals are, try to be responsive and sensitive. Even when our answer is no, we want to let them know we heard them. And we need to oftentimes think about nonverbal ways for kids to respond, even if they are verbal, mostly because we can prompt a correct response if it's a nonverbal behavior, such as touching a Big Mac switch to make a choice of a toy. And then lastly, it is almost always a good idea to think about using visual cues to support language in all activities, but particularly when an activity with young children is very language heavy, some learners are really going to need some visual cues to support what it is that they're hearing. So I hope these general suggestions and considerations are useful. I do recommend that you check out those YouTube videos I mentioned, and definitely go through the appendices in your text. Thanks very much for your time and attention. Next week we'll be covering Module 6 as we move into social and emotional development.